didn't really know what to say today. I mean, when we start talking about this, Rick Day, a good friend, is here that helped us a lot with this. And he summed it up just now. He said, did you ever think that first time you guys went out with metal detectors that it'd ever end up in something like this event? Hey, Jimmy. And I didn't. I mean, I had no idea. We got started on this, and I want to take a moment first before I forget and thank a lot of people. Mike, where's Mike Mitchell? Stand up, Mike. I think it was me and Mike that got started on this, that we ran across this incident that we heard about. We'd grown up in this part of the country. We never knew anything about the Battle of Blanco Canyon, never heard of it. And some events led us to that. We both worked at the district attorney's office in Lubbock at the time. And we decided to start looking into it. So that's generally how it started. Jimmy Isabel joined us right after that. Stand up, Jimmy. And he was one of our investigators as well. And we started researching this thing. And then we started getting an idea where this might have happened. And then it came down to start getting the metal detectors on the ground, okay? And we started out blind, had an idea maybe where this occurred, and we started going out and hitting things. And as this occurred, we started meeting other folks. I mentioned Rick and Susan Day. Would y'all stand up right quick? And Bill. Invaluable help of showing us how to do this sort of stuff, the archaeology involved. Came out and helped us weekend after weekend after weekend. And you're going to come up in a minute, if you haven't already, and see these cases with a few artifacts in them. I sat down earlier this week, just shorthanded, and came up with an average of how many people came out every weekend, for how many years we came out, and how much walking was done. And came up with about 5,000 miles pretty quick. And so that's just right off the top of our heads, you know, doing it once a weekend, 3 people, 5 people, something along those lines. So there's a lot of miles went into this bit of artifacts that you're going to see here today that we put out on display. But Mary Sue Potts, where's she? She was here at Mary Sue was invaluable in our group. She came out and worked with us, being able to get it from a historical standpoint of, you know, how is the right way to do it? And that was the key, is doing it, not just going out there and finding things and putting them in a box, but doing it correctly. As I said, Mike and I and Jimmy, when we started this, we were district attorney investigators. We're cops. That's what we did, you know. And we treated it that way. That's the only thing we knew. We didn't know how to do it any different. So we started looking for things. We started looking for records. Mike went to Washington, D.C., spent a lot of time in the map area of the National Archives. I went to the National Archives 3 times for a week at a time, digging through records and finding things. And all it was to take the artifacts that we were finding and putting a paper trail with them, just like any criminal case that we could work at the time, trying to bring this together to prove this was the actual site. There were other sites that had been mentioned over the years. People had thought it was in one place or another. And it's hard to prove, you know. I mean, none of us were there. It's hard to prove of who's right and who's wrong. And so you get the detectors out, you find the artifacts, and then you find the paper trail to do that. And one of my favorite stories, I don't know, some of y'all know, I found this gun over here. I found that one. And everyone says, well, that's a great find and everything, but this map on the wall over here is a map that I found in the National Archives. And what made it such a good find is I was looking for anything at the time. You know, it may not be the actual Battle of Blanco Canyon 1871 map, but maybe there's a map from 73 that someone mentions it. So the National Archives, you just tell them kind of these boxes of files that you want, and they bring them to you, and you just start digging through them. I mean, and it's the actual records from whatever year you're looking at. And I was there for a week, and I had been there all week. It was Thursday, and I'd said if I don't find something by Thursday afternoon, by the time I go home, I'm going to just take off and go to Gettysburg. I'm not going to come back, and I'll be done with the archives. Well, about 4 o'clock on that Thursday afternoon, I found this map. And it is the actual map that Mackenzie and them created right after the Battle of Blanco Canyon. And what made it such a great find was Robert Carter, who was so involved in this and who wrote about this battle, who participated in the battle and wrote a book about it. He had asked the National Archives for this map. And I had the note from the National Archives to Robert Carter that said, there is no map, it doesn't exist. So as far as even the archives knew, it didn't exist at that point. And to stumble across it at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon was really amazing. And all of these are great finds. We always had a lot of fun with this, but I can remember opening this map up and it dawning on me what it was. And then the next thing I pretty much remember was one of the clerks saying, "Sir, you need to calm down." and when you're trying to tell somebody in Washington, D.C. about a battle in Crosbyton, Texas, and how exciting it is, it kind of falls on deaf ears. I'm sure they'd sort of dealt with that a little bit before, but that's what it involved. It involved all these people, not me. They let me talk because I talk forever, and I'll get off here in just a second. But it's a lot of people that pitched in to find this deal, and a lot of people that put in a lot of time and effort to make it happen. And I know I'm forgetting folks, but it's always this time of year during Memorial Days and 4th of July that I really think about this battle and what went on and what this mural represents. You know, there's a soldier out there buried, and like any soldier on Omaha Beach or in Vietnam or wherever he was, he gave the sacrifice just like they did. And it deserves to be recognized, and I'm really, really proud to be part of something like this here at the museum to sort of document this and put it together. So it was a long process, years of research, years and miles of walking, and finally putting it together of something that we can actually say, this is where it occurred. So we'll be around here after that, so if you guys have any questions, we'll stick around as long as you want, and I think I'll turn it over to Ron now.
Not only because it's a cool place to be when it's 103 degrees, but hope we can give you a pretty good show. Todd, thank you for your comments. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be here. Or we'd be looking at a mural that's a blank canvas.
Ron, you can use the microphone. They're having trouble in the back here.
Can y'all hear me? This is technology. Is that better? Technology and I usually don't get along too well, and I have a tendency when I talk to wander back and forth. So I'll try to bellow like a bull, and if someone can't hear me, just shout. You have to shout louder than I am. I suppose the place to start is to pull the cover off this thing, don't you think, Anna? Yeah. Grant, you reckon we can handle this?
I think we can handle it, bro. Whenever you're ready.
I'll let you look at it for just a second, and then I'm going to have to talk about it. Folks, what I want to do, on the program it said the artist is going to explain the artist process. Well, artist process is all fine and well, but if y'all don't know why this fight happened, artist process doesn't mean a hill of beans. So I'm going to tell you all why this all came about. Now, the battle took place October 10th, 1871. But to properly put this in perspective, I'm going to have to walk you back to 1867. The West was a very different place. There weren't as many cotton farms. But there was a whole lot of buffalo. In fact, if we were standing right here 150 years ago, we'd be knee-deep in buffalo dung. You ladies excuse the earthiness of that expression, however it's true. But you know what? All that buffalo dung, it must have made the cotton grow, so. Y'all that grow cotton, you cotton farmers, you might want to get some buffalo down here. But never mind, never mind. I goggled. Folks, this is a map of this area in 1870. Don't worry, after we're all done, y'all can come up and take a look at it point blank range. Some of you folks may have a hard time seeing it back there. I'll explain to you. We are right there. Crosbyton. Now this is the Cap Rock. The Cap Rock in 1870 and all the area around it belonged to the Comanche and the Kiowa. Point south belongs to the Mescalero Apache. Now the government saw the handwriting on the wall, and they knew in 1867 that the old days were coming to an end. The railroad was pushing across Kansas. The buffalo herds were diminishing, not quite to the point where they did 10 years later. The great hunt didn't start until the mid-1870s. So there were still plenty of buffalo around to feed a lot of wild horse nomads. Well, the government had a choice. They could either annihilate the Indians or assimilate them. They chose assimilation. So they convened a huge powwow, Medicine Lodge, Kansas. They tried to get all the Plains tribes to come. They only had semi-success. And what they said to the Indians was this: we'll give you food, we'll give you clothing, we'll take care of you. We're going to give you a reservation. But you got to settle down. You got to learn to farm. You got to quit raiding and stealing and killing in Kansas and Mexico. The Comanches, at the height of their power, claimed from the Arkansas River down to the Rio Grande, from the Pecos River in New Mexico to the Cross Timbers, roughly Fort Worth, 200 million acres. Now what the government offered them was 2.9 million acres, right there in Indian Territory, what we call today Oklahoma. Now that doesn't sound like 2.9 million acres. I have had no offers recently if anyone wanted to give me a section, let alone 2.9 million acres. It sounds like a lot, but when you have controlled 200 million acres, it doesn't sound like much of a trade at all. The Indians didn't take it seriously. Now some of them did show up at the treaty ground because the government, some things never change. The government always gives away gifts at powwows. So they showed up to collect the coffee and the sugar and the clothing. And then they made a demand, which the government went along with. They said, we need modern guns and ammunition to hunt. Our bows and arrows and lances don't do so well anymore, which wasn't exactly the truth. So the government gave them modern guns and ammunition. Some of them more modern than what our soldiers were carrying. You see how things don't change. The government wanted to turn wild horse nomads into welfare recipients. And the Indians didn't want to have anything to do with it. We want your gifts, but leave us alone. They didn't believe the stories about there are so many white people to the east that they're more numerous than the stars in the sky. Well, they've never been east. Why would they believe? To a Comanche, war was the fiber of their society. A Comanche, a Kiowa, any Plains Indian, the man had two jobs and just two jobs: to hunt and to fight. Now you had to hunt, which for Plains Indian means you hunted buffalo. But fighting, that's how a young man raised his social status. A young man starting out would apprentice himself to a well-known war leader, and they would go on raids. Now, we're talking about horse nomads, so they were primarily after other people's horses, although they weren't below stealing mules either. if you successfully completed a couple of raids, your status in the tribe, in the band, in the clan, rose immeasurably. That way, you had your pick of any girl in the village, or any other village. You were asked to join the best men's societies. You were asked to join the best warrior societies. You had a good shot at becoming a chief. That was attained only one way in the world of the Plains Indians: through raiding, killing, and stealing. It's what they knew. That was normal to them. And the government's telling them, you got to stop this. You got to live on this little plot of land, well, considering what you think of 2.9 million acres, and take up farming and give up the old ways. Now, the Indians have been raiding into Mexico for 100 years. They devastated all of northern Mexico. The ranchers couldn't make a living. They lost stock. There was a highway coming down right through this country of y'all's called the Great Comanche War Trail. The Indians would go down in the fall after the summer rains when they came. The water holes and the springs would fill up so the horses could travel because there'd be grass. They would raid northern Mexico, at times as deep as within 100 miles of Mexico City. And if you've looked at a map of Mexico, that's a big chunk of the country. They gather up herds of hundreds of horses, mules, and they'd also take women and children as captives because they would bring them back north and indoctrinate them, adopt them into the tribe. That was very important because statistically, Indian women in a typical Indian camp outnumber men by 5 or 6 to 1. Well, when you go to war for a living, you tend to get killed off. And hunting buffalo was a little bit different than shooting jackrabbits. It was a dangerous occupation. So they were always wanting to bolster their numbers. The Indians wouldn't do it. I said, we've got no reason to give up and become white men. In fact, one Comanche chief at Medicine Lodge had a very profound statement, and it sums up the whole situation right here. He said, you're going to build us houses? You want us to learn how to farm? You want us to quit raiding? If we do that, we cease to become Comanches. I couldn't put it any better. So that was 1867. Battle took place in 1871. Between 1867 and 1871, there was a lot of warfare going on the plains. Our Red Brothers hit the Santa Fe Trail very hard, raiding. They continued to hit Mexico. They stopped the line of Texas settlement. Now, this line right here is the line of Texas settlement in 1870. It was the same line in 1855. For 20 years, the settlers could not go any further west. Roughly Fort Worth. If you decided to homestead, farm, raise stock, west of Fort Worth, you were in great danger of losing everything. Your home, your hair, your stock, your family. Because the ironic thing is, some Indians did move on to the reservation. Well, the government continued to give them handouts if they came in. Wintertime's a hard time to make a living when you're a horse nomad. So for the winter, even the wild bands would come into the reservation. They'd be given food. They could settle down peacefully because the soldiers were now chasing them. The soldiers were not allowed to go onto the reservation by government edict. Well, they'd collect their food, they'd settle in for the winter, get their guns and ammunition, then they'd head back out to the Caprock country right here. But they also loved to raid due south. This area right in here, that's why it was depopulated. No one could live there, no one could settle there. Well, there had been so much killing going on by 1870 that President Grant decided that the peace policy that he'd been trying wasn't working. And he turned William Tecumseh Sherman loose on the Comanches. Now, for all those that name rings a bell with y'all, William Tecumseh Sherman was the Yankee general that burned Atlanta and devastated Georgia on his march to the sea during the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on what side you want to say. Sherman, in turn, turned a colonel loose on the Comanches, Raynald McKenzie. Raynald McKenzie had an illustrious record in the Civil War. He was a tried and true combat veteran. He was wounded grievously more than once, and those wounds, the effects of those wounds, stayed with him all of his life. McKenzie came up with a plot. We've got to take the war to the Comanches. Now, at the time he said that, 1871, nobody knew this country. This was unknown. Remember my reference to the ankle deep and buffalo dog. The buffalo knew it. The Indians knew it. Mexican Comancheros from New Mexico coming over to trade for stock and captives knew it. No one else did. No white man. Even the Rangers had not penetrated this area. Now, it was thought to be a desert. It's not really. There are hundreds of springs and playa lakes dotting the entire Llano Estacado. The Indians knew the trails. They knew the water holes. They might not always be full, but they could make it from an empty one to the next full one. They had this knowledge. McKenzie hired Tonkawa Indian scouts. Now, the Tonkawas and the Comanches and the Kiowas, and just about everybody else, were bitter enemies. You see, the Tonkawas had this really unpleasant antisocial habit. Well, they're cannibals. The Comanches took great umbrage to cannibals. Now, a Comanche he'd slit your throat, he'd scalp you, he'd run off with your wife and family, but when it came to eating people, he drew the line. That's it. Boy, did they hate the Tonkawas. The Tonkawas' only friends, because all the other tribes hated him too, was the white man. So they made great scouts. McKenzie enlisted as many as he could. The Tonkawas sort of knew the State Plains, not as intimately as the Comanches, because if they ever went up there, the Comanches would kill them. But they were better than nothing, so they guided McKenzie on his first expedition. Now, McKenzie's first expedition, when he left Fort Richardson, came down to the Double Mountains along the Brazos, and then up the White River, or the freshwater fork of the Brazos, as it was known then. It's got a Comanche name too, but my Comanche is just a little bit rusty, so I'm going to report a little that. He found the Comanches. He was not an experienced Indian fighter at the time. He learned. Actually, the Comanches knew he was coming. They sat up on the Cap Rock. They seen the dust. They ran into some Tonkawas, had a little fight, so they knew that there were soldiers coming after them. So they were more or less prepared. On the night of October 10th, right around midnight, the troopers were tired. They'd been going up arroyos, down arroyos, up blind canyons, down blind canyons. They were running short on food, forage, rest, which is a soldier's lot in life. Sometimes they didn't quite know where they were. Sometimes the Tonkawas didn't know where they were. The only people that knew where anybody was Quanah. And I won't say Parker. He became Quanah Parker when he surrendered. He was now Quanah. Quanah and his boys had been watching him. So they decided to spring a little trap for themselves. Comanches were good at this. Right around midnight, the soldiers had bedded down. They were exhausted. Some of them didn't even change it out of their uniforms. They laid down in their uniforms, some of them peeled down to their underwear, dead asleep. The campfires had gone out. There was no movement. Juana and a large number of his boys hit the camp out of nowhere. Now, there were about 600 horses and mules in McKenzie's camp. Every one of them stampeded. You know, even if a horse is tired, the war cry of the Comanche was said to be able to raise the dead. Well, they literally did that night, because these horses and mules didn't think they could go another mile. But as soon as the Comanche let loose with their war whoops, those horses and mules were up and running. And they ran right into the soldiers' camp. It's a rude awakening at midnight, when you're dead tired, having ridden 20, 30 miles that day, to be awakened by a thundering herd. It's not a tornado. Sounds like one. It's not a thunderstorm. No. It's somebody that's good here can multiply 600 times 4 legs. That's how many hooves were heading your way towards your bed. Now, the horses weren't loose. They were picketed. This is a picket pin. A clip attached to this ring. And to that ring was attached a picket rope. Every soldier carried one on his saddle. There's one right here. That's how you stake your horse out at night. You drive this into the ground. And hopefully, a tired horse will not pull it out. Well, a tired horse won't pull it out. They graze a circle of about 20 feet, the length of that rope, and then they get some nourishment during the night. However, when you've got a horde of Comanches screaming like the Banshees of Hades, you pull your picket pin and you take off. Carter, who Todd has referenced, Robert Carter at that time was a second lieutenant with McKenzie. He gives us most of what we know about this fight. Excellent writer. Excellent. The boy went to West Point and they really taught him how to write. It's a good book. If you want to learn the history of your country out here, get a copy of it. It's fascinating. It will hold your interest. Now, he says that the picket pins came loose and were flying. Well, they were attached to halters to the horses and the mules. And they were flying through the air. Imagine, if not 600, 300 or 400 picket pins flying through the air. He said they were more dangerous than bullets. Well, I imagine they were. It was pitch black. Nobody could see anything. A lot of these troopers, they got up in their underwear. Excuse me, ladies, I did have to pay a few soldiers in their underwear. It's called artistic license for the sake of authenticity. I hope you'll forgive me. And the next thing you know, you've got a picket pin slamming into the side of your head. It does not enhance your appreciation for the red man's culture. Let me put it that way, especially at midnight. Soldiers tried to grab onto ropes. I painted this specifically for the exhibit. This horse right here, the gray Dapple, that was McKenzie's horse. He had obtained a horse at Richardson when they left on the expedition, a gray pacer. It ran off. This corporal is trying to hang on to it and save it. Well, he didn't. He ran off with the Comanches. Never seen again. At least not by a white man. Juana Parker ended up with it later. Soldiers were getting up. They were firing their Spencers. But you're firing at shadows against a pitch black sky. They didn't hit anybody. But they sure were getting pummeled by these picket pins. Comanches managed to pull off about 60 head. Run them off up the canyon. Well, obviously, soldiers' camp was in turmoil. Nobody got much sleep the rest of the night. They were gathering horses. They were gathering their gear. They're trying to get themselves ready for what came in the morning. And they knew in the morning they'd have to go after the Comanches. Lieutenant Carter managed to hold on to his horse. So he went on picket duty just as the light was breaking right there over the cap rock, checking to see, could you see which way the Comanches went? Can you cut their tracks? Where do we go? Are there any out there still hovering around the camp? Well, turns out one of the outposts saw some Indians on the horizon. They had horses. Well, that's all a soldier needs. A bunch of them mounted up and gave chase. Well, Quanah was a pretty good tactician. You got to understand, at this time, Quanah was not a war chief. He was an up-and-coming young man. He was in his early mid-20s. He was not known to any white men because he never came in. He stayed out with the wild Comanches. He didn't even come in for government handouts. He had pride. But the Indians knew it. Quanah was pretty smart. He launched the oldest trick in the book. Armies have been using this since before the Romans. The Mongols used it. I'm sure the cavemen used it. You send a decoy in, you aggravate your enemy, one way or the other. Stealing his horse is a pretty good way to aggravate him. And then you run off. You act like you're running off. You lead him. Once you get him chasing you into an ambush spot, a kill zone, and then you let loose. That's what happened. Quanah and his boys abandoned the horses, so you had Lieutenant Carter and 5 troopers and a Captain Hile and 7 troopers. That was the band that was chasing a handful of Comanches and a bunch of our horses. Well, they rode down an arroyo, up an arroyo, across broken ground. All of a sudden, they topped a rise, and there in front of them, in front of this outcrop of the Cap Rock, were, we don't know how many, 50, 75, 80 Comanches, sitting on their horses, watching the soldiers, because they could track them by the dust, they knew they were coming, top this rise. Carter writes, it was as if an electrical shock went from one end of the line to the other. They were frozen in place. They turned to each other and looked, and no one could utter a word. The Comanches must have been enjoying it for a few seconds because it took them a while before they charged, which was probably lucky for the soldiers. Now, Captain Hile, who should have been in charge, the ranking officer, he was really froze. Carter turned to him, waiting for orders. Hile didn't have any to give. He just stood there and he said, "My God, we're in a nest." Now, that's an old-timey expression. I've read it many times in accounts. It's a reference to the hornet's nest. Y'all ever stir up a hornet's nest? They don't just buzz around. They come out, they see you, and they come after you. A hornet's a nasty thing to stir up. Well, so is a Comanche. In fact, the title of the painting is The Hornet's Nest. I took it from Captain Hile's statement. Carter said, "We need to deploy, sir. We need to form skirmish line. We need to engage these guys." Hile just said yes. He took his end of the line, so it's a skirmish line. That's a line of soldiers. Straight line. And you hold that front against the enemy. Well, Captain Hile went 100 yards. Now that's a long way for one officer and 7 men to get away from the other soldiers. It leaves a pretty big gap, especially in open country. Carter dismounted his 5 soldiers from G Troop, and he told them, "Shoot, but single rounds." Now, the U.S. Army at the time was armed with an excellent weapon. It was the Spencer repeating carbine. The Spencer is actually a lever action single shot. breech loader. It's all the above at the same time. It was the most popular cavalry arm of the Civil War. It did a lot to help them Yankees with the Confederacy. It loads through a magazine into the buttstock, 7 rounds. Now at the time, that was revolutionary. You all who are used to AR-15s, M16s, 30-round magazines, that seems pretty primitive. Remember, just a few years before, they had single-shot musket rifles. Stood about this tall, you had to ram the rod down. It took you a while to get off concentrated fire. The Spencer was revolutionary. So you load your 7 rounds, you lock it in, you work the lever. That puts a round into the breech. Close the lever. But you still have to cock the hammer. Then you shot. It shot a 56-50, roughly a 50 caliber round. It was a great gun. The round was a little underpowered. Went about 300 yards effectively, maybe a little bit more. But in Indian warfare, you didn't need to get too much further than that. Because if they had their druthers, they were going to close with you. So Carter and his men dismounted. How many folks here have dealt with horses? There's a few. I've dealt with 1 or 2 myself. I can tell you for a fact, and you all know this who've been around it, a horse doesn't like excitement. A horse, under duress, will do 1 of 2 things, fight or flight. 99.8% of the time, they're going to choose flight. Usually they'll run over the top of you, get in the way. These horses had just heard 75 or 80 Comanches give off the most ungodly war cry that you could possibly imagine. They were tired. The horses had been rode down all summer. It had been a long campaign. So these boys had to dismount. Comanches were now charging. And what Carter says is they came like a cloud towards us. They had to hang on to their horses, who were rearing, plunging, going backwards, going sideways, probably stepping on a lot of feet. At the same time, they had to work their Spencers and engage the enemy. Single shot. Now I say single shot because the model 1865 Spencer, which was improved over the Civil War model, had a little notch here called the stapler cutoff. The stapler cutoff, once you flip it, turn this into a single shot. It cut off the magazine. He told his men, cut off the magazine, use it single shot. Carter was very smart. He was already thinking, we are in a nest. We really are. And we got to conserve ammo. So the troopers carried their ammunition in cartridge boxes on their belt, but sometime on their sling. Being the cavalry, they had to hold on to their long arms, a horseback. Now with a fully loaded magazine, this is about a 9-pound weapon. It's a little heavy. The sling comes across here and it clips to this ring. And so it usually hangs right here, even when you're on horseback. Now it's not ideal because it bangs around. The soldiers are loading from their pouch, 1 round at a time, firing at the Comanches. All right, they dulled the Comanche charge. They didn't stop them, but they took some of the enthusiasm away from the Red Brothers. One of Carter's troopers at the time, after they'd been throwing some rounds down range at the Indians, said, "Lieutenant, look over there." Captain Heil and his 7 troopers decided not to engage. They turned tail and galloped back to camp. Now, in his defense, Captain Heil had an outstanding record in the late War of Northern Aggression. He was a good soldier. His 7 troopers were raw recruits that had never been in action before. The Army has so many holes in its ranks that they would take troopers, throw them right into the line without much training. Believe me, the Army didn't waste much money or time on training in those days. Well, these boys couldn't take it. Apparently Captain Hile couldn't either, because they couldn't run. All of a sudden, it's Lieutenant Carter and 5 troopers from G Troop. Now the Comanches saw this. They were real happy about it. Carter said they let out a whoop of glee. They were tickled to death. But instead of chasing Hile and his 7 troopers, they chose to cover Carter's flank, which means they wanted to encircle him, Little Bighorn style, and get all the way around. Carter gave his men an order: mount. Continue to engage the enemy, but we cannot turn and run. There's an old frontiersman expression from the Indian Wars. It said, if you run from an Indian, you become his meat. They will treat you like a buffalo. They will run you down, shoot you, club you, or stab you, and then scalp you and steal your horse. A running man is a panicked man. He's not a fighting man anymore. Carter knew this. He held his men together in a line. Now the horses were starting to get peppered with arrows. The Indians were closing ranks. There were a whole lot of these flying through the air. Indians were very good at shooting from horseback. You don't take direct aim when you're on the back of a running horse, not with a rifle, not with a bow. You learn to kind of point shoot. You throw in the general direction, let loose, and then shoot again. Well, the horses were turned into porcupine quills. Believe me, when you've got an excited horse that's listening to 85 screaming Comanches, and he starts getting arrows in his rump, and his shoulder, and his neck, he gets even less manageable than he was before. Some of those troopers were taking wounds. It was turned into a close combat action. Finally, Carter gave the order. Engage your magazines. Let them have it. So, 5 troopers, because Carter did not carry a Spencer. He carried a Smith & Wesson revolver, model of 1870, very new firearm at the time. And they let loose 35 rounds at these Comanches, who at the time were maybe 40, 50 yards away. That's within range. It stopped the charge. Indians were falling from their horses. Horses were falling down. They were making their shots count. Now at that time, Carter's idea was a fighting retreat, a tactical retreat. You don't turn your back. Keep shooting. Fall back slowly. Now they were a long way from McKenzie's camp, but he was hoping McKenzie had heard the shots, and just like John Ford and John Wayne, would ride to the rescue. That's what he was hoping for. Sometimes it did happen in the old days. Well, they couldn't afford to turn around and look. They had to keep their eyes on the Comanches, who were trying their best to kill them. Trooper Leander Gray was on a flea-bit gray horse. It was probably the weakest horse in the command, and none of these horses were in good shape. Carter says he himself felt his horse's legs trembling beneath his knees. He said, "Lieutenant, my horse is giving out." Sure enough, Carter turned and looked, and Leander's horse was starting to go down. He's played out. Now, at the same time, somebody else saw this happening. Juana, who must have been one heck of a warrior in his day. He had noticed that that's the weak link in all of these troopers. So he made a beeline charge straight for Leander Gray. And following him were maybe, we don't know, 10, 20 followers of his, favorite warriors, warriors who saw that the time for the kill was now. He dug his moccasin heels into the flanks of his coal black pony, whose name we later found out was Running Deer. And he made not a straight line, but a zigzag toward Leander, bent low over his horse, and he had a cap and ball pistol in his hand. Now Carter says he couldn't get a shot at it, neither could his fellow troopers, because Gregg was in the way. If they'd have shot at Quanah, they'd have hit Gregg. So no one could do that. They said, watch. Quanah rode dead straight then at Gregg. He straightened out his zigzag, had his pistol up, shot him in the head. We don't know what he was carrying, but in homage to Todd and his wonderful discovery of an 1858 Remington, I put an 1858 Remington in Quanah's hand. Maybe it's that same gun. We don't know. That's the fun about historical archaeology. A lot of guesswork, a lot of hoping. Maybe so. Maybe so. Anyway, Gregg tumbles from his horse. And Carter writes, I couldn't believe it. Quanah did not stop, jump off his horse, and scalp him. Well, he was only 15 yards away from Carter, but Quanah knew something else that the boys from G Troop did not. Directly in back of them, about where you all are, there was a rising cloud of dust from Mackenzie's camp. Mackenzie had heard the firing, and he mounted up as many soldiers as he could, and in the best John Wayne tradition, rode to the rescue. Of course, the Tonkawas, our free-feeding friends, were in the front, yelling and screaming. They were confident because they knew they had their enemies, the Comanches, at a distinct disadvantage. Quanah and the Comanches had been watching the soldiers coming, but they wanted to get in one last lick. Trooper Gregg, unfortunately, was the victim. Quanah rode, pivoted, and they rode up yonder way, beyond this outcrop, which on old maps I've seen is called Mount Blanco. It is not part of the Cap Rock. It is an outlier from the Cap Rock. Cap Rock is actually on the blue horizon, over yonder. Now they escaped. Mackenzie showed up. They all rallied and chased him. But in essence, that's the story of the fight, folks. It really wasn't a knockdown, drag-out battle. It was more of a very sharp skirmish. But of course, it's easy for me to say that. I wasn't sitting on a tired horse with trembling legs, firing a single-shot 50 caliber at 75 Comanches, who really was hoping I hadn't had a haircut before I left the fort so that they could lift my scalp. Lieutenant Carter won the Medal of Honor for his actions in this fight, and deservedly so. He kept his head. He knew how to think like a soldier. He was an inspired leader. The other 5 troopers in G Troop had served with him previously on scouts and in the field, so they knew Carter's temperament. They knew they could trust him, so that when he gave an order, they would obey. That's paramount in the military. If you don't respect your leadership, disaster will entail. Now, you may be curious what happened to Captain Kyle and his 7 raw recruits. Well, he ran into Mackenzie and the Tonkawas. He was told to about face and go back to the rescue, and they did. So their line of utter retreat didn't last too long. Folks, there's a tendency these days to belittle the old-time cavalry trooper as incompetent, and to turn the Indians into helpless victims. The Comanches that I've talked to relish their ancestors' reputation as savage, ruthless warriors, and they take great pride in it. When you say the word Comanche, you can have an argument with any tribe you want to, but the epitome of the horse nomad warrior comes to mind. Now, Uncle Sam's troopers in blue were seasoned soldiers, regarding the more raw recruits, who underwent great hardships, 14, 15, 16 hours in the saddle, day after day after day, chasing down, well, Plains Indians were the best guerrilla fighters that ever lived. It's arguable that they're in the top 5. Chasing these guerrilla fighters down, they did a heck of a duty, and their duty was unsung. As a testament to them, the Indians would not fight them in an open stand-up fight if they could possibly keep from doing so. They believed in ambush. They wanted the advantages on their side. They did not fight like Europeans. To them, acceptable casualties was 0 on our side, many on yours. That explains Indian warfare. They fought individually. They didn't fight in concert. The cavalrymen and the Comanches deserve to be honored on this 4th of July. They lived in a world so different from this one. It was a world where it was an honor to kill your enemy. We should honor their courage and remember them for what they were. They were warriors, every single one of them fighting for what they believed in. We promised you a question and answer. So if y'all, most of you stayed awake, I'm really impressed by that. If I see too many people fall asleep, Anna had specific orders to bring in a couple of wheelbarrows of buffalo dogs. Seeing if anybody would notice, at least they can smell it. Never mind. Anna killed the wheelbarrows. We're doing okay. So if y'all have questions, Todd and I can field them. If we don't know an answer, we'll make something up. Sir?
How far from right here was that?
Sir?
How far from right here was this?
Todd found the site on a ranch. Todd, I'm going to let you have this one.
It's you know where White River Lake is? It's just on the ranch north of that, on private property. It's the Glass Ranch. The hills out there, as you go towards the lake, you can, if you get to their gate, you can look out across there and see the hill. That's the hill you'll see as you go back into the ranch. You can't get on there without their permission, of course, but it's just right there as you go just north of the lake.
Sir?
I'm not quite the middle school that was found that pistol.
So would I.
The question was about how did the pistol come about, how did it come up, and it was like so many things out there. We were out there on Martin Luther King Day. We were off work. It was a Monday, and it's about 11:30. I kind of remember this a little bit. But I was out there with Mike and Jimmy. And like always, Jimmy is somewhere I can't even find him. And Mike was over there. And even though it was Martin Luther King Day, which is February, it was pretty warm. And it was one of those days, I can't express this to you. I needed to thank my wife, Lena, who's here, because she helped pay for a lot of this and all this great stuff. And she put up with she calls them trinkets. All the trinkets that came into the house, all the cleaning that had to be done. But we were out there and trying to mess around, trying to find something. But on a good day, we would mark everything with GPS. So any of these shell casings, any buckle, anything we found out there in this battlefield, we would mark. And we would designate it and keep a record of it, just like we would a crime scene. And I can't convince, you have to understand, if we put 3 things on a map in 8 hours, it was a good day. That's how much walking this was and how much detecting. But it was one of those days, and they were off out there, and I was kind of doing I'd get to be like the 5-year-old every now and then, where you don't have any bones, and I'm ready to go eat, and I'm like, where's everybody at? And lo and behold, I got a signal up against the cactus, and had no idea what it was. You learn these metal detectors that a bullet casing runs about a 78 number it gives you. So you start learning these things. Well, this was in the 30s, and I'd never dug anything in the 30s. I didn't know what it was until I dug it out. And the way I dug it, when I took a shovel out, I saw the barrel. But I didn't know it was a barrel. I thought it was a piece of rebar, an old piece of rebar concrete that somebody had dropped out there. There was a little bit of trash out there every now and then. And what Harry Bob's talking about is I reached down and pulled that gun out, and it could have been a rattlesnake, but I just dropped it and started backing up because I knew what it was. I didn't know where it was from or what it was at the time. But I dropped it, backed up, and went back over there, took a look, and called Mike and Jimmy, and we took it in and had it treated. There's an interesting story behind that gun. And I put a little bit on it on the holder that we have it on. I wrote that on there, but this gun, it has some interesting quirks. Number one, it has a big C on the grip. If you come over here, you'll see it. It's a stamped C. Now, they would say that this gun, this particular gun, it was, sorry, I need to back up a little bit. The serial number is visible. We can track this gun to March of 1864 during the Civil War. It was made for the military. But the C means, for some reason, it didn't pass inspection. And it was condemned. Now, they say the C means civilian market, not military, but it really means condemned. And what the company would do when these guns got condemned, they would run it back through the factory and try to fix whatever was wrong with it. So we know this gun didn't go to the military. It went somewhere else. We also know that gun has round, hand-poured ammunition in it, the bullets. It has 6 chambers, and 1 bullet is missing. That's the one I say it is. Who knows? But 1 bullet's missing, but that was hand-poured ammunition. The military wasn't doing that. They hadn't been doing that for 20, 30 years. They were using bullet-shaped bullets in these guns, and we found a lot of those. So this was a gun that had hand-poured ammunition, and it had been condemned. And at the bottom of the grip, there's a turkey track carved into the base of it, which I'm told no trooper would have done. You don't do that to U.S. government property. So we took all this together of the turkey track, the round ammunition that we know is not military, and the fact that it was condemned to know that that pistol was probably carried by a Comanche that day without much doubt. So it really was a good find, and something we needed to put this battle in perspective, and luckily we ran across it that day.
Sir?
The battle's been marked. There's a place there, and the burial site, there's a tombstone there.
Not on Leander Gregg's side. Like I said, every time during these holidays it comes up again, and I start trying to make calls. I've hit dead end after dead end trying to get the military to get a marker out there for us. And it's not because they don't want to do it. They really don't have anyone that specializes in 19th century stuff anymore. But most of these markers, you can only get them if you're family, if you're trying to get for a family member. And so I've kind of ran into a lot of roadblocks, or it's not even a roadblock, I've not been on the road yet, but every time I've been trying all week to get hold of a bunch that I thought may can help. But the marker's not out there right now, we just know where the burial spot was.
Okay.
Sir?
You mentioned the Hornet's nest, the warriors that they gave. It wasn't all warriors, wasn't it?
The hills in back were fairly well filled up with Comanche women who were watching their menfolk, and what they were sure was going to be one heck of a knockdown, drag out victory. And Carter and the troopers heard them giving the peculiar tremolo, shrill, I can't do it. You don't want me to try, because I've tried. Cry, which was meant to encourage their husbands to carry on bravely. The fact that we were watching, we're with you, and knock them dead. So yes, the women were there too.
Adding to the excitement of
The overall did, yes, excitement. Sir?
Was the painting done after the discovery and was done with archaeologists, kind of, so that when you're pointing these people with the theory, which is good.
Yes.
Was that painted black with your description?
The mural was painted last year, and there's a person I have to thank you for that, and that's Todd. He got me onto the battle site. He took my wife and I out there. If I had not been on the battle site, I could not do the picture. There's things you just don't work with photographs the professional does. So Todd took me out there. We walked over the site, and we actually stood right here from the perspective that I chose to try to get everybody in. So it was a result of Todd's years of hard work, dedication, and it's as much a part of this as all the research that I did. So we're kind of a partnership, you might say.
I got something to add to this. About 35, 37, 38 years ago, myself, Wayne Parker, and one other person went down there with an old World War II metal detector, and we ran that thing over it. And two of the biggest things that we found one area that kept the thing activated. And so we started digging, and we dug up 211 mule shoes. And after we got that out, well, then we still deeper than that. Well, we found a whole keg full of horseshoe nails. And we dug that out and brought it to the museum, and what's happened to it since then, I don't know. But anyway, we had quite a number of shells that were spent, and they some of them were crushed and whatever. But anyway, it's somewhere in this museum. I don't know where.
Well, somebody from McKenzie's column, probably the Sadler sergeant, probably got his head taken off for losing shoes and nails. Now, the shoes could have been discarded.
No, the point was made that they were planning to come back there.
Their cash, yes.
And they were coming back to it. That was part of their equipment. And there was quite a number of utensils that they ate with and things of that nature. And they were all bundled up. And anyway, it gave a strong indication that their intentions were that they were planning to come back there.
Hopefully the quartermaster sergeant never found out about it. McKenzie never found out about it. The Army being what it is.
I didn't keep the penny. I didn't keep
the accounting for government property, they get pretty serious about that. Todd has found trooper grave.
Yeah, we found what's left of the burial. There's a map back here that Carter drew by hand, and he talks about burying him and putting rocks on top of the grave. And what we found was there's an area up against that hill, the way Carter described it. And you can just picture him digging a hole and having a little ceremony and putting rocks on top of it. Carter talked about the wolves that were in the canyon. So there was a lot of rocks placed on this. Well, the area around that hill, you can sort of see, Ron did a good job.
Would it be approximately here in the mural?
Right, it would be along this edge. And it's eroded since then. It sort of took that grave where it was on the flat ground, and it sort of eroded out from underneath it. And we found some human bone, human skull, tissue or pieces, and some teeth. Right now is what we have. We brought the medical examiner's office from Lubbock County out. They had a girl here with us, one of the technicians. We sifted the grave. We found 16 grommets, which would have been on a cloth that the troopers carried. And it was a rubberized cloth that they would lay down and sleep on at night to keep the moisture off of them. But these cloths had 16 grommets around the edges. And we found an eagle button in there, 2 Spencer cartridges, and so what we call underwear button, which are these iron 4-hole buttons. So we're pretty positive, that's where his final resting place was. It's exactly where Carter said it would be, and the stuff is there. So we have identified it, and still we would like to move a bit away from the hill and put a marker up out there at least. And all the remains we did recover are at the medical examiner's office in Lubbock. We'd like to get them reinterred there and maybe have a ceremony someday or something. But it belongs out there. We hope we can get that done. Yes, ma'am.
In, I'm gonna say 1982 or 83, I was with a friend and I made a photograph of private graves, gravestone. Now, where is that in relation to the actual burial?
That's about 10 miles up the canyon, okay? And I'm not here to talk about what anyone thought back then, but I mean, it just was, these are all long stories, I hate it. There was a burial found back in the 50s there. And it wasn't an Indian burial. They knew it had some buttons, but these buttons had like anchors on them. And Troy Smith and Wayne Parker found this when they were kids. And so word has it that it gets around that Wayne and Choice found a burial out there. Well, the sheriff showed up at Choice's house, which was the big house in the canyon at the time. And they said, what'd y'all find? And they kind of said, well, we found a burial. But that's what they did then. They went looking for these burials, Comanche burials and stuff. That was a hobby. And they had dug into it and they found a skull and stuff. And the sheriff said, well, we think it may be a guy on the road crew that was murdered. And Choice said, you know, I kind of felt bad about that because I had that guy's skull on my dresser with a cap on it. And so the sheriff took the skull and if you want to talk about a different time, sent them boys back out there to excavate that grave and find out what else they could find. Well, they found some bullets. They found a bullet up around the neck area, and they found a bullet down towards the leg area. They didn't know what they were. I mean, we can identify those things pretty easy today, but back then they didn't know what they were. And so it became, at the time, it was just surmised that's Leander Gray. What else could it be? It's not the guy from they decided it wasn't the guy from the road crew. So it became that was Leander Gray. Well, the only problem with that is when you start looking at the record, and I talked to Choice, who unfortunately passed away last year, took a wealth of knowledge. I mean, it was a real shame, but I talked to Choice a lot about that grave. And I said, you know, how do you know that was Choice? Well, that's what Wayne thought. And I said, okay, that's good enough. I said, but you know you had that skull, right? Did that skull have a bullet hole in it? He said, no, it didn't. There was nothing there. But we had got the records. In this time of, you know, we can get records real easily if you look hard enough. I had the report from the surgeon on the trip. Dr. Rufus Choate said, Leander Gray died with a gunshot wound to the head. So clearly, that couldn't have been Leander Gray. But at the time, that's what was assumed, and you know, rightly so, I guess. But we pretty well got that settled, I think, as far as that. But that's not too far. It's up in the canyon about 10 miles from there.
If y'all are wondering what happened to Trooper Gray, you'll see that he's trying to work the lever on his Spencer. Well, lever actions are made of good American steel, and if you want to use them properly, you work them hard. You don't work them easy. Leander's Spencer jammed about there. So we either had a double feed or bad ammo, but he kept trying, or he was too weak to actually rack it properly. So he's sitting on a horse that's about to go down, working this lever as Quan is closing on him by the second. Lieutenant Carter yelled at him, drop your carbine, which would have been attached to his sling. Pull your pistol. But by that time, it was too late. So that's how Trooper Gray met his demise. It was part of a malfunction.
And any of the guys that I pointed out earlier and some others that have hunted with us, one of the things that I've always went back to, and it always surprised me, not surprised, but it sort of hit me hard, was all the dropped ammunition out here in this battlefield. It must have been right on top of them. It must have been going fast, because as they're trying to load, they're just dropping bullets before they can get them in their gun.
What do you think about fumbling finger? The cartridges are loose in the box. They're not in canvas belt loops, which didn't come about for a few more years. It wasn't an efficient way to carry ammunition, but it's whole simple. It's the best way that we had to do it. And even then, they couldn't carry near enough. So that's, I'm sure, one of the reasons why it's scattered everywhere.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Can you explain Quanah's headdress if he wasn't the chief yet?
You know, that's one thing Quanah never mentioned. But I painted the picture of Quanah exactly from Lieutenant Carter's description. Lieutenant Carter had an amazing memory. It must have been photographic, because while all this was transpiring, the attack, tragedy transpiring of Trooper Gregg, and Quanah bearing down on them, all of which would send anybody these days to PTSD, he was able to say Quanah wore a feather headdress with a trailer, single trailer. Occasionally they had double trailers. His face was painted black. Now, amongst the Comanches, black was war paint. Other tribes, they would only paint their faces black for victory celebrations. He had a bear claw necklace around his neck. Well, he was carrying a Captain Ball pistol, so I gave him a cavalry holster. And he had loop earrings in his ear. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I don't think I'd have taken in half of that. Especially for someone that I was trying my darndest to try to shoot. So, Quanah, it depends. Tribes had different customs. Because Quanah's star was rising, he might have borrowed the war bonnet. I don't know, at that young age, to be able to earn every single eagle feather. Traditionally, every eagle feather in a war bonnet trailer was a coup, a victory, a personal victory that the Indian had to achieve. So I have thought the same thing. So in his early 20s, it was nothing short of amazing. But we know he had it all.
Remember, Trooper Gregg was enlisted in the Army of Lincoln, Pennsylvania. He was from Pennsylvania. He was assigned to Fort Cavalry. He got killed in 1960. That's where he was from.
Yeah.
With our group research, those days. Private Gregg, the William Hanks also was another soldier.
You're right. I even talked to Leander Gregg's family. I talked to the two uncles of his that had done some history on him, and they said, he kind of just disappeared. We didn't know really what happened to him as they were looking for their history. So it was kind of nice to get that settled for him in a bad way, I guess, but at least they knew what had happened at that point.
So we just remember those people on this holiday.
You bet.
They're real people.
You bet. Sir.
I just want to say thank you, guys.
I'd like to put that thank you right back on y'all. This is y'all's history. This Caprock country, this Llano Estagalo, State Plains, Texas Panhandle, there is so much history. It's layer upon layer upon layer, like the stratus there in the Caprock itself. And for you all, the board of the directors of the museum, to have the interest to want to capture something like this very sharp skirmish, which was very real life to the men who were involved in it, is a testament to your spirit as Americans and Texans, by God. I can say that I'm a West Texas from Mexico, but and sense of self. Otherwise, this wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be talking about Trooper Gregg, Quanah, or Lieutenant Parker. So
Are you aware how Quanah Parker was captured?
Sir?
Are you aware of how Quanah Parker was captured?
Yes.
Up in Palo Canyon.
Yes. Aladura Canyon, which happened in 1875.
The cavalry shot all of their horses up on top of the Caprock down the canyon where they would be immobile.
Mackenzie and every cavalry officer that ever fought Plains Indians, Custer learned it the hard way too, learned that when you capture a herd of Indian horses, You cannot hold them. These are people that make their living at stealing horses. And if you think you're gonna take 50, 100, 500 horses that you've just taken from their village and herd them out on the prairie with guards who are probably going to sleep because they've been in the saddle way too long, it doesn't happen. Comanches, Cheyenne, the Sioux, they were very successful at reversing the odds within 24 hours, recapturing the horses and running them off. So the cavalry policy after Custer's attack on the Cheyenne village at Washita was you capture the Indian horses and you kill them. Because if they fall back into Indian hands, it's like handing them back their ammunition to go at it again. An Indian afoot, if he's a Plains Indian, he's not harmless, but he's been taken down a few notches, at least till he can steal somebody else's horse.
I would like to address something, please. We have been on the Quanah Parker Trail. We've done a lot of research. We do not believe Quanah was ever captured. He was not in the fray. He had Ridgeway was the place that he was when he was told. And Wayne Parker tells his story of how his great-grandfather or whoever was told that through the partners that Quanah had he was sequestered. He had his whole group, his tribe, and they were considering what to do. And Dr. Strum had been sent to say, "Come in, or we will annihilate you." He was, to my knowledge, into the Quanah Parker Trail information, he was never captured.
That's true. Quanah wasn't captured.
The initiative then to say, and Wayne Parker said there was an eagle circling over that went toward Forest Hill. That was the message that they should go to the reservation, and they walked in. They took their horses in, and the horses were taken away from them. Another thing that I heard recently was McKenzie was a bad colonel in that he was not sympathetic to the Indians. But I would counter that with that Fort Sill. He did everything he could to alleviate the pain and suffering the Comanches had to have in going there. So I just wanted to correct that as far as
I'm sure McKenzie has his detractors, but he was probably, and is acknowledged by most historians as being the most successful Indian fighting officer in the United States Army. When you bear in mind that he had horrendous wounds from the late war, which he had to endure while enduring long days in the saddle. He was a strict disciplinarian. He broached no nonsense, but he was a fair commander, and his troops may not have loved him. You don't necessarily want your troops to love you, but you want them to respect you and have confidence in your leadership. McKenzie was all of that. And very, very true, Quanah was not captured. He was smart enough to read the handwriting on the wall. He came in and surrendered, and then he volunteered to help the army. He went back out on to the Llano Estacado and helped bring in the wilder elements that refused to surrender. And that took a year or 2, 3, 4. There were some bands that were just unreconstructed. I can understand that. They didn't want to give up. Quanah went out to get them before the army found them. And he was successful every time. He was.
So how far is this site from where Captain Lawton's was?
From what?
The supply camp.
The battlefield from the supply camp is 2 miles. It's right there. I mean, it's all in the same place.
So if you're going down White River, I mean, is that ranch right, the glass, I know what Glass Ranch is, that gate right there, it goes back to that right there?
You'll
That's
see
where you
that
can see it from now?
right down the road.
Yeah.
When you get to that gate, it'll be, it's
Yeah.
right straight there.
I took that map down if you want to reference it. I know you kept talking about it. It was
Oh,
thank
good,
you.
so.
Yeah. This map, this is some of the incredible stuff we ran across. I found this map in Carter's personal papers. There's a private collector in Arizona that has his personal papers. And Carter drew this which is the diagram of the battle. And he talks about the red X that he drew. That's where Leander Gregg died. And he has notes on here of where he was and where Gregg was and where the Comanche were and everything. It's a great map if you want to come up and see it. Wish we could have made it bigger, but it's just really well done in him being able years later to pinpoint what went on and how it happened. I was telling Ron earlier that Carter kind of reached out to me personally because when you find these letters in these personal papers that this man had out in Arizona, he had a relationship with two people out here in the 1920s where he was writing letters. And you could feel it in Carter's letters, and he was telling these folks, go find Leander Gregg. He's out there. And he told them exactly where it was, and I think, like then and is like now, a lot of people were like, well, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. It was a long time ago. This all happened up in the canyon. So when we started zeroing in on this, it wasn't because we wanted it to be in Crosby County or we thought it was in Floyd County or wherever. We started this because we didn't know any better. And we just followed what Carter said, and he was right on the money. When he was in his 80s, he was telling people where this happened and where to go. And people sort of just ignored it and kept going up into the canyon. But he was really adamant about go find Leander Gregg. It really stuck with him his entire life. And he lived till 1936. And he was writing books and he was writing articles about all this. And you could tell it really stuck with him that Leander Gregg was out here buried.
Is that your Thursday afternoon bonanza?
What's that?
Is that your Thursday afternoon bonanza? That map that you were just holding up.
Oh, no. This is that map.
Oh, that's.
This is the map that McKenzie and them did when they returned from the expedition. This is a diagram of the battle that Carter did for his book that they put together about his exploits out here in the canyon. Okay, and one chapter of his book is about the Battle of Blanco Canyon when he was out here in 1871. Carter, he was kind of an extraordinary soldier, and he got wounded this day. After the battle happened, he was chasing them up that hill. There were Comanche in the rock shooting at him, and they sent men up there, and his horse fell on his leg. Thought his leg was broke. It wasn't broke, and he continued on with the expedition. But within 2 years, that injury had him mustered out of the army. He was disabled, and it ended his career. And you often think what somebody like that could have accomplished if he would have stayed in the military. But
Was he in the second expedition?
he came, no, this was the only time he was in this canyon, and he wasn't here in 1874. He was actually on medical leave for the leg back home in May.
May I make a comment about Wayne Parker? Wayne Parker, for 10 years, his mother and dad would take him down to Silver Falls and let him out with a roll-up piece of plastic and a box of Hershey candy bars, and they would pick him up. That was on Sunday evening. And the following Sunday evening, and sometime they'd come back and pick him up at the same place. And Wayne died. He was a diabetic, and he told me, he said, George, I can't stand it. I've got to have some chocolate. And it finally took his life. But as far as when I personally look at any of this stuff, Wayne Parker did more research, and he went to West Texas State College, and he on weekends he went down in that canyon, Paladura Canyon, and he showed me where the soldiers shot all of the horses off of that cliff to demoralize, take all of the transportation, I'll try to say, away from them. He was extremely interesting to talk to. And Troy Smith is in He is an encyclopedia to all of this. He's a very, very brilliant artist. Thank you.
Folks, is there anything else we can do for you?
Great job.
Well, thank you for coming.